In a sealed glass case at the shrine of the book in Jerusalem, there is a fragment of parchment about the size of a playing card. On it are 6 lines of Aramaic, and those 6 lines describe a place beneath the earth with 4 separate chambers, 4 separate populations, and 4 completely different conditions. None of them resemble what any Western church has ever called hell. The Book of Enoch was voted out of Scripture at the Council of Laodicea in 364 of the Common Era. The Church called it forbidden, it called it dangerous, and for 17 centuries that is where it stayed. Then, in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls came out of the caves at Qumran, and among them were 11 separate copies of Enoch. More copies than were found of Deuteronomy, more than most of the books that stayed in your Bible. And when scholars translated the oldest fragments, what they found was not a single lake of fire where sinners burn forever. Enoch describes a structured system, 4 chambers, each holding a different kind of person, each running by different rules. And the rules that decide who goes where are not the rules the church has been teaching you your whole life. I'm Julian Crane, an archaeologist the establishment pushed out when I started asking the questions my colleagues wouldn't. So on this channel, I dig up the history they left out. If that's the sort of thing you want more of, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get into what the Book of Enoch actually says hell is, and the specific sins that really send you there. The main account sits in chapter 22, in the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers. Fragment 4 Q206, held at the Israel Museum, carries the Aramaic text of this chapter and dates to around 100 years before Christ, which makes it older than every book of the New Testament. The complete version survives in the Ethiopic manuscripts at Axum. Dr. George Nicholsberg, whose commentary on Enoch is still the definitive scholarly reference, called chapter 22 the most structurally detailed description of the afterlife in any Second Temple Jewish text, and Second Temple Jewish is not a footnote. That is the tradition Jesus himself grew up inside. The tradition that shaped what the earliest Christians believed about death and judgment and what comes after. Enoch 22 was part of that. It was known, it was cited, and then it was removed. This was not one strange man's private idea. Dr. James Vanderkam of Notre Dame, one of the leading Dead Sea Scrolls scholars alive, has written that Enoch's afterlife framework was almost certainly familiar to the authors of the New Testament, and the 4-chamber structure shows up in more than one fragment. Related material appears in 4Q204 and 4Q208, with slightly different emphasis on what sends a person to each chamber. Dr. Lauren Stuckenbrook of Munich, whose work on the Aramaic Enoch tradition is the most detailed available, noted that the Qumran fragments show multiple scribal traditions, all working from the same 4 hollow framework, multiple communities, multiple scribes, multiple copies, all preserving the same basic structure. This was not a fringe teaching. It was the mainstream afterlife model of Second Temple Judaism, and what the Council of Laodicea removed in 364 was not the margin, it was the center. What replaced it, a simpler and more manageable afterlife, was the innovation. The original is still in the fragments, still in the Ethiopic, still waiting to be read. The text begins like this. The angel Raphael takes Enoch to a mountain in the far west, and behind that mountain is a place he describes as vast, dark and divided. Not one space, 4 separate hollows, each sealed off from the others. The Ethiopic manuscript uses a word for hollow that Ethiopian monks also used for a cistern, a deep container built to hold something specific and sealed to stop it mixing with anything else. The 4 hollows are not connected. What is in one cannot reach what is in another. And that matters, because what Enoch finds in each one is completely different, and the reason a person ends up in their particular hollow is precise, not general. The first hollow deserves the closest attention, because it is the one that unsettled the Western Church the most. Enoch describes it as holding the spirits of the righteous. Not the perfect, not the saints, the righteous. People who lived ordinary, decent lives and died without great sin. And they are in a condition the Ethiopic describes as rest, under a spring of bright water, not paradise, not reward. Rest and brightness, because they are waiting. The text is explicit that the righteous dead are not yet in their final destination. They are in a holding state, kept in comfort, until a judgment that has not happened yet. Sit with that, because it is the detail the church could not accommodate. The righteous dead in Enoch are not in heaven. They are waiting in a place that is comfortable but unfinished. This is not the Catholic idea of purgatory, which involves purification through suffering. The first hollow involves no suffering at all. It is simply not the end. The end has not come. The second hollow is stranger still. It holds the spirits of people who died as victims of violence, people killed without justice, whose murderers were never punished. And Enoch says something about this hollow that appears in no other ancient text. The spirits here are not at rest. They are crying out. The Ethiopic uses a verb that elsewhere in the manuscript describes the sound of rushing water, constant, continuous, impossible to shut off. And the choice of word matters. It is not the word for crying, or weeping, or screaming. It is the word for the sound of water that cannot stop, a spring, a river, something that flows because its source has never been cut off. The murdered dead in the second hollow are not in agony, they are in motion. Their sound is not the sound of pain. It is the sound of an unresolved claim pressing against whatever holds it, a case that stays open because it was never closed. And the text is explicit that the sound does not stop until judgment, not until God decides the case, not until the death is formally heard and entered into the record. The murdered dead are making a continuous sound in the second hollow, and not for vengeance. The text is explicit about what they are crying for. They are crying for their case to be heard, for their deaths to be officially entered into the divine record. The parallel Ethiopic text uses a legal term here, the same term the scribes used for a complaint formally lodged but not yet judged. The second hollow is not a place of suffering, it is a place of pending action, a case still open on the divine docket, and what sends a person there is not sin. It is being sinned against without remedy. The wronged dead, who were never avenged, are held in a specific place, in a specific state, making a specific sound, waiting for a reckoning that has not arrived. Notice what the whole thing actually is. The afterlife in Enoch 22 is not a moral economy built on reward and punishment. It is a record-keeping system built on specificity. Where you go after death is decided by the precise nature of what was left unresolved at the moment you died. It is a legal archive, every case filed separately, every condition maintained until the relevant proceeding. This is exactly why Jerome later called it too precise. A vague, general hell leaves room for the church to mediate. A structured system with specific criteria for each chamber leaves no room at all. And the container image is worth staying with, because it changes the whole feel of the thing. A cistern is not a prison. A prison is built to punish the person locked inside it. A cistern is built to preserve what is stored in it, sealed so that what is inside cannot mix with anything else, maintained until the day the contents are needed. That is the word Enoch reaches for. 4 cisterns, 4 different contents, each sealed from the others, each kept in its own condition, none of them opened until the judgment they are all waiting on, which means the afterlife Enoch describes is not at its root about torment or reward. It is about storage, preservation, keeping each kind of unfinished business intact and unmixed until the case that concerns it can finally be heard. That is a profoundly different picture from the one most of us were handed, and it is sitting there in the oldest copies we have. Then comes the third hollow, and this is where Enoch breaks hardest from what the Western Church has taught. It holds sinners, but not all sinners, specific sinners, and the specification is the whole point. The third hollow is for people who committed sins and received their punishment during their own lifetime, who paid their debt while they were still alive, who suffered for what they did before they died. These spirits are not at rest, but they are not being actively punished either. The Ethiopic describes them as set apart, in a condition it calls dim, not dark, dim. They are not in agony, they are in a state that says the account is settled, but the record remains. And there is a detail here that almost no popular account of Enoch ever mentions. The people in the third hollow are dim and alone, not resting together the way the righteous rest together, not crying together the way the murdered cry together. The sinners who paid in life are isolated, each one separate. The Ethiopic uses a word the scribes used for scattered grain: individual, unconnected, present but not grouped. This is not punishment, it is consequence, and the difference is everything. Punishment is something done to you. Consequence is something that is simply true about you afterward, and it needs no one to enforce it. The debt was paid, the account is closed, but paying a debt does not restore what the debt damaged. Their accounts are settled, and their connection to everyone else was severed by what they did. They are settled, they are dim, and they are alone. It is the most psychologically specific passage in the whole chapter, and the least discussed, because it describes a consequence that requires no ongoing divine action. The isolation simply is. Absence simply is. The part that should not be possible is how closely this maps onto the newest research into near-death experiences. Dr. Sam Parnia at NYU Langone has spent over 2 decades studying what patients report during cardiac arrest, the window when the heart has stopped and brain activity can no longer be measured. His work, published in the journal Resuscitation in 2014, documents a consistent pattern. The distressing experiences almost never involve physical pain. They involve a sense of unresolved accounting, unfinished reckoning, a feeling of being held at a boundary, aware of something that has not been settled. Enoch describes the murdered dead crying out for their case to be heard. Parnia, across hundreds of independent accounts, documents a distress defined by awareness of unresolved accounting. 2 sources, separated by more than 2,000 years, describing the same thing in the same functional terms. And a second study, in 2022, also led by Parnia, found that awareness during clinical death was sometimes joined by a simultaneous awareness of the impact of one's actions on others. Not guilt, awareness of consequence, that matches the structure of Enoch's 4 hollows more closely than it matches any Western idea of heaven or hell. Not one undifferentiated destination that everyone is sorted into, but a structured accounting based on the specific nature of what a person did and what was left unresolved when they died. Now the 4th hollow, which is the one that most resembles what Christianity calls hell, and the Ethiopic is precise about who is in it. The 4th hollow does not contain murderers in general, it does not contain liars or thieves or adulterers, it contains one specific category of person. People who sinned, were never punished in life, and allied themselves with other sinners. The Ethiopic uses a compound phrase that means those who helped wickedness continue, not just people who did wrong, people who protected and sustained wrongdoing in others. People whose actions made it possible for harm to keep going after it would otherwise have stopped. These spirits are in darkness, and the text specifies active suffering, using a word that elsewhere in Enoch describes the sensation of heat without any visible flame. And unlike the other 3 hollows, this one is described as permanent. The text uses the same word for its permanence that it uses for the permanence of mountains. Not until judgment, ongoing, with no announced end. Now, let me be clear about what I am and am not saying. I am not telling you Enoch 22 is a literal floor plan of a physical underworld with 4 rooms beneath a mountain in the west. The text passed through centuries of copying and translation before it reached the manuscripts we can read. What a Second Temple writer understood and what an Ethiopian monk copied 1,500 years later may carry distances we cannot fully measure. But what the text says, when you follow it carefully in the Aramaic and the Ethiopic, is not vague. It is a structured system with specific criteria: rest for the ordinarily righteous, waiting on judgment; unrest for the unavenged murdered until their case is heard; dim, isolated settlement for the sinner who already paid in life; and permanent darkness for those who kept wickedness alive in others. And not one of those criteria matches what any Western church has been teaching for 1,600 years. The suppression of this account is documented, and it is the fourth hollow that explains it. The Council of Laodicea removed Enoch in 364, and the recorded grounds were descriptions of the afterlife that exceed what has been revealed. Jerome, working on the Latin Vulgate around the year 400, wrote that the book's afterlife descriptions were too precise to be authoritative. Too precise, not too vague. Precision was the problem. Augustine, writing around 415, argued that detailed accounts of the afterlife should not be circulated because they would lead people to calculate their standing rather than simply fear God. He was not saying Enoch was false. He was saying a structured afterlife with specific criteria was less useful to an institution than a general judgment that only the Church could interpret. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, outside Rome's reach, kept Enoch in its canon and copied it faithfully for the next 14 centuries. And when the Scottish traveller James Bruce carried 3 Ethiopic manuscripts back to Europe in 1773, the Oxford scholars who examined them did not call the afterlife chapters false. They called them structurally incompatible with Christian doctrine. Incompatible, not untrue. The structure was the problem, then as now, and that is the tell. A general hell for sinners is a deterrent the Church can manage. Preach against sin, offer absolution, collect the penitent. But a permanent hollow reserved specifically for people who sustained wickedness in others, who protected harm from its natural consequences, who kept wrong alive after it would otherwise have died. That category does not respond to absolution. You cannot confess your way out of a structural role. You cannot be forgiven for a system you are still maintaining while the system is still running. The fourth hollow's criterion implies that the structures which protect wrongdoers from consequences are themselves a category of sin, not the wrongdoing itself, the protection of it. And once you frame it that way, you can feel why it could not stay in the book. Think about what it does to a system of absolution. A man who steals can confess the theft, and the theft is a discrete act with an end. But a man who runs the machinery that lets the theft keep happening, who shields it, who absorbs the complaints and files them away and keeps the thing running, is not committing a single act he can name and lay down. He is a load-bearing part of an ongoing harm. There is no moment of contrition that stops it, because the harm does not depend on his intention. It depends on his position. You cannot repent your way out of a role while you are still standing in it. Enoch places exactly that person, and only that person, in the one hollow with no described way out. Jerome read this passage. Augustine read this passage. Neither one said it was wrong. Both said it was dangerous, and the danger was never theological. It was institutional. A church that read the fourth hollow carefully would have to ask what exactly it was protecting, and whether the protecting was the sin. In 2018, a team from the Hebrew University applied to the Israel Museum to run a detailed comparative study of fragment 4, Q206, alongside 3 related Enoch fragments, specifically to map the 4-chamber description against the other Second Temple afterlife texts. The museum approved access to 2 of the 4 fragments. The other 2 were listed as undergoing conservation. Conservation of 2 specific fragments out of a collection of thousands that happen to carry the most detailed afterlife content in the entire Enochic corpus. The comparative study was published in 2020 with the 2 available fragments, and the researchers noted in their own conclusion that the 2 inaccessible fragments likely contained material that would have substantially strengthened their findings. Those fragments are still in conservation. No timeline has been given for their return. I am Julian Crane. The fragment is still in its glass case at the shrine of the book. The Ethiopic manuscript that preserves the whole chapter is still in Axum. The 2 fragments that would complete the picture are still, 6 years on, undergoing conservation, and the criterion that Enoch places in permanent darkness is not the criterion you were taught to fear. It is not lust, or theft, or unbelief. It is sustaining the wickedness of others, protecting harm from its consequences, keeping wrong alive in the world after it would otherwise have stopped. That is what the oldest structured description of the afterlife we possess calls the one condition with no way out, and it is still carved in Aramaic on a piece of parchment older than the New Testament, waiting for someone to ask why the church found that specific line too dangerous to keep. So before you accept the version you were handed, read the one they removed, and ask yourself which chamber the people who removed it were trying to stay out of. I'll see you in the next one.